Well, hello, everyone. Thank you to today's session. We're very happy you're able to join us. My name is Quinn Slobodian. I'm a professor of international history at the Boston University Pardee School of Global Studies. And I'm very happy to welcome you today to this first of a series of webinars on the histories and futures of global governance. Today's session is called Can Institutional Reforms Be Made Meaningful? And it is part of an ongoing series of online discussions that the History and Political Economy Project, which is directed by myself and New York University's Christy Thornton, are putting together in cooperation with BU's Global Development Policy Center, which has been kind enough to host the webinar today, in a sort of a series of ongoing conversations about what, if anything, the role of the practice, the discipline, the lessons of history are in trying to think of a better form of global governance infrastructure, especially at a time where the very idea of international institutions is very much in question, and the possibility of a kind of medium-term fragmentation of the whole thing into kind of a set of competing pluralistic blocks seem more on the table than it has been for a while. So we're very happy to be able to start this, what will be no doubt a very interesting conversation, with a panel that combines, as we hope, expertise and policy experience and depth of knowledge from both the world of economics as a discipline, but also the world of history as a discipline, and actual existing kind of policy making in the spaces of multilateral institutions and national governments attempting to create more just and equitable systems for everyone. So what I think I'll start by doing is introduce our panelists here, before we get started with what is going to be more of a free-form conversation. I have some questions to seed the discussion, and then we'll certainly leave space for the people who are attending, which looks like there's about 50 of you right now, to ask your questions and have your say about this incredibly pressing political question. So to begin with the introductions of our panelists, we're joined, moving in alphabetical order, with first Adriana Abdenour, who we're very happy to have joining us here. Adriana is the co-president of the Global Fund for a New Economy. She has served until quite recently as a special advisor in international affairs to the president of Brazil, and was co-founder and executive director of an independent nonprofit dedicated to issues of climate change and international affairs, with programs in climate justice, global governance, and international cooperation. She's also worked for, had research and teaching assignments with other organizations, including the United Nations University, Sciences Po, Catholic University in Rio, as well as Columbia and the New School. Presently, Dr. Abdenour is on the ECOSOC Committee for Development Policy. Second, we have Richard Kozel-Wright, who is a senior fellow at present at BU's GDP Center, and is also a professor of sustainable structural transformation at SOAS at the University of London. He has previously worked at the United Nations in both New York and Geneva, where he was director of Globalization and Development Strategies Division in UNCTAD. So has had many years of thinking about exactly the questions we're hoping to discuss today. Thirdly, we have Jamie Martin, who is an assistant professor of history at Harvard University. He's a historian of capitalism, empire, and international order, and has studied some of these questions more in historical perspective. He's the author of The Meddlers, Sovereignty, Empire, and the Birth of Global Economic Governance, published by Harvard University Press in 2022, which digs into the kind of origins of a lot of these questions of institutional reform and stability that we are debating today in a more contemporary context. He's now writing a global history of the economic consequences of the First World War, and has published things all over the place, including the New York Times, London Review of Books, N+1, The Nation, Book Forum, and Dissent. So as you can see, we have people who have, in many cases, kind of one foot in both the policy world and the kind of academic world. In some cases, people coming more out of a deep knowledge of a past conjuncture, in the case of Jamie. And the reason that we've gathered you together. The reason we're doing this whole series in the first place, the whole motivation for Christy Thornton and I to try to launch this longitudinal dialogue is because we felt that as historians ourselves of earlier moments where there were attempts, especially from global South actors, to try to seize and reform or make better multilateral institutions, thinking especially of things like the new international economic order, there was often a sort of sense of amnesia or deja vu where, 10 years later, 20 years later, people would still be talking about the same things and often the exact same language. And we weren't sure if this was a sense of people kind of knowing the history too well who were inside these policy circles and knowing that you just have to keep going back to the same demands, or if there was actually a kind of historical amnesia in certain ways inside of international organizations that led to a kind of inability to really come to terms with what it means to have asked for the same things for so long and fought for the same things for so long, and to have been disappointed in such a serial way. So our kind of opening question for the three of you, and I'll start with you, Adriana, is what role does, in your own experience, history play in these kind of policy discussions, which are so much often about, hardcore compromise, horse trading, and kind of like immediate pressing concerns? Do you think about the past? And if so, how does it inform or complicate even your efforts at policy?
Thank you, Quinn. Can you hear me well?
Hear you great.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here and congratulations on the project. I wish it had started earlier because when I was in government, it would have been a wonderful sounding board. But those who are still there on the front lines will benefit greatly from this project. And I hope that some colleagues are listening in. If not, I'll keep them posted. And one minor correction to the introduction. I served 2 mandates on the Committee for Development Policy of the UN, but my second mandate ended in December, so I'm no longer formally a part of the group. And the institution that I founded here in Brazil with Mayara Folia is called Plataforma Cipó. I just wanted to make sure that the name got out there. It's a think tank based here in Rio, but with a staff pretty spread out and working now very closely with the Brazilian government as well. So that's a great starting question. I think, based on my experience in the Brazilian government, there was always a tension between the speed at which, as a policymaker, you have to either take or shape decisions, including at the multilateral level. You don't always have the luxury of preparing substantially further ahead. And on the other hand, the need to understand the historical trajectory, both the obstacles to reform, but also windows that have opened up in the past. And I like very much your use of the term amnesia, because I think there is sometimes a lack of capacity to keep up with the research and then immediately apply it to a decision-making space. But I think in certain spaces, there is a manufactured amnesia of prior reforms. And often, for instance, when it came to UN reform, one of the topics I worked on while I was in President Lula's office, you often heard terms like reform fatigue. This is before the current context. So, let's dial back to a couple of years ago. And I would ask myself, like, what fatigue? Fatigue by whom? And now maybe you can talk about, certain fatigue or a fear of moving or of the inevitable changes that will come. But I feel like I felt like there were efforts to constrain the conversation, and that had a temporal element. And it would often be up to individuals such as yourselves who straddle the divide between academe and policy, and who really had a good grasp of the historical trajectory of that particular discussion. So, for instance, someone I often think about and I've worked with very closely is Cedric de Koning from South Africa, who's an expert on peace building and peacekeeping. And I think, he's become like a real reference for those of us who have worked or worked on peace and security reform, including the Security Council, because he has this encyclopedic knowledge, but also a very good feel for how these spaces are built and the dynamics that operate them, even at the geopolitical level. So I would say on the part of progressive people who want to reform in a good direction, right? Because not all reform is good, as we are seeing and some of us experiencing at the moment. So we also have to break down this terminology of reform, but there are capacity constraints. And I think sometimes it depends very much on you having almost like a pre-existing or a very quickly formed relationship to someone like yourselves or like Cedric, who are very strategically placed, have that stock of knowledge that can feed into the process. And then finally, not all decision makers or policy people are interested or willing, to take that route. I'll finish by just making one reference to one item I worked with. These are always collective efforts, of course, but at the latest General Assembly of the UN, President Lula gave a speech in which he called openly for a review of the UN Charter. And he's not the only one to do it, but I think he was the first sort of major world leader to do it very openly at the General Assembly. And in order to build that speech, our team and the team at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had to go back and really dig through, Article 109 and the different sub-articles and the clauses that open up and that in the past were invoked. And the one piece of evidence of this amnesia is that there's actually, paragraph 3 of Article 109 explicitly suggests a mandatory charter review conference after 10 years, but this not only never happened, but it's seldom discussed openly within the doors of the UN. So that's what I mean by, I think they're manufactured amnesias along some capacity constraint.
Can I ask one quick follow-up on that, which is maybe just concretely. So if you say that at these sort of critical moments, it can be helpful to have, scholars who are, how does that work? You just get them on the phone, you get a quick Zoom together. Do you commission something written from people? Do you involve them more long-term in projects like this? How do you tap into that knowledge?
That's a great question too. So in our office, my direct boss was Celso Amorim, right? Who is the former defense and foreign minister, who's now the chief special advisor to President Lula. And he had the foresight of putting together a team that wasn't just made up of diplomats. Now, some of the diplomats also have great historical knowledge, so I'm not singling them out. But he made sure to include at least 2 of us. When I arrived, it was a very small team. I was the only research background person. Now there are more. I think there are 2 or 3. And yes, I would WhatsApp. I had the modern Rolodex, and sometimes people are more flexible and willing to talk to you. It's very hard to even schedule something next week. Those of you who have worked in government at that level know that you're constantly reacting to the context. And in our case, our office became a bit of a crisis management office. My work involved the presidential vision for the G20, so I had more time and I was able to defend that time a little bit better. But I would say between phone calls, sometimes I would ask for small papers and always insisting, write me a 1-pager and then include a link to a longer paper if you have that, because even though I'm a scholar by training, you just don't have time to breathe, let alone read papers.
Great. That's really helpful. Richard, maybe you could help. I bet you have a lot of similar perspectives you can share with us. Mute. You're muted.
I don't think it's just a memory loss problem. I mean, there is a rewriting of history also that goes along. And that's become more apparent, I think, in recent years. I mean, to take an obvious example, the notion of a rules-based international order, which is tripped off the tongue of most of the great and good in our spaces, assumes that there's a kind of continuity that begins in Dumbarton Oaks and ends, with a improved system sometime in the last decade, which has begun to unravel. I mean, which is clearly a misread. There's lots of gaps and breaks and reversals in that history that tends to get written out by many who are part of the multilateral system, both in terms of the Secretariat and in terms of the member states. It's always good and Adriana did that, because I think there's an assumption that it's a kind of homogenous mess, the kind of multilateral world. But I mean, there are some very different players with different aims and different interests involved in that space. But I mean, I think that rewriting of history is, and for, and obviously most of my experience was in UNCTAD, which kind of, in kind of desperation, hung on to our history a bit longer than other institutions. I mean, essentially we lost the fight. UNCTAD lost the fight in the late 70s, early 80s about what we understood the multilateral system to be about, and it shifted in a very different direction. And for us, I guess history did serve that purpose of reminding people, two, I think. One, reminding people of where they came from. The hypocrisy of advanced economy policymakers in this space is quite staggering, actually, and things that they benefited from in the immediate post-war period, they now kind of either deny ever happened, or certainly deny that there's any relevance for developing countries today, right? So exposing the hypocrisy. We did use history, I think, to expose the hypocrisy and the double standards of a certain constituency within the multilateral space. And I think the other one is, there's a real richness there of proposals that have been put to one side and deserve to be revisited. Adriana mentioned one in her case. I mean, we look at the debate around special drawing rights, which kind of surfaced again during COVID, and that's a debate that UNCTAD was involved with back in the late 60s. I mean, the only reason you have a universal access to special drawing rights, that is, developing countries have that access, is because of UNCTAD. And many of the issues that were being discussed, in the last few years were, of course, discussed back then. Different environments, of course, and different nuances, but there's a real treasure trove of ideas and proposals that have been forgotten, I think, in much of the rewriting of multilateralism over the years.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in on that, one of the things that actually first sensitized me to this being a place that could be interesting was years ago reading an UNCTAD report, and in the preface there was a reference to Eric Halliner's book on the forgotten foundations of Bretton Woods, which is, for those of you who haven't read it, and you should, it's about the fact that the largest by numbers number of delegates at Bretton Woods were people coming not from the richest countries, but from places like Latin America and North Africa and China. And the demands that they made at Bretton Woods were suppressed, but then sort of returned in different ways in the 1970s and in institutions like UNCTAD. And for me, that was actually surprising to think that a multilateral institution would find a history useful in the exact way you're describing. I'm sure you probably had a hand in that precise preface, perhaps. But is it effective? I mean, does the use of history as a kind of way of speaking truth to power, as it were, have any impact? Is there traction there, or is that just wishful thinking?
I think it has some. I mean, to give you another example, which I know is slightly controversial, but using the Marshall Plan as an example of a successful large-scale aid program. And it was, I mean, you know, we can debate about its relevance within a geopolitical context and
Mhm.
and the double standards that were part of that. But it was a success. It was the most successful, I would argue, large-scale aid program of the post-war era. And lots of people always go back and make when there's a big problem at hand, people kind of make oblique references to the Marshall Plan.
Mhm.
Gordon Brown has made about 43 references to the Marshall Plan, for example, in one form or another.
Mhm.
Um, but you know, I mean, it's not a kind of, it's a very superficial reference to the Marshall Plan, and going back there and just kind of exposing some of those ideas to developing country diplomats, for example, which I do, you know,
Mhm.
gives them ideas, gives them ammunition too in the particular struggles that they may be facing in negotiations on economic issues in our board or in so it's not going to transform the world, Quinn, but it
Mhm.
can serve a very useful purpose.
Yeah. I think I want to come back to that because I know that Lula used that analogy himself recently. But I want to give Jamie a chance to jump in on this and see what you might have to say from the research you've done.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like at least three kind of models of historical analysis come to mind here. We have this idea, you know, the first would be kind of correcting the record of fixing a historical amnesia and exposing hypocrisy. And the kind of importance of that seems self-evident. Then we have this idea of kind of resurrecting models from the past, of returning to good ideas that got left behind for bad reasons. The Marshall Plan didn't get left behind, obviously it got enacted, and it kind of stands to this day as this kind of, you know, supposed demonstration of the possibility of American largesse on the global stage and so on and so forth. We have the kind of constant invocations of the new international economic order as this kind of wonderful moment of missed opportunity, but that deserves to be resurrected. In fact, is kind of constantly rhetorically resurrected. During the Eurozone crisis, you know, people talked a lot about the international clearing union idea. You know, Keynes's proposal that got left behind during the actual Bretton Woods debates and so on and so forth, right? So this is the kind of the importance of this, again, seems self-evident, right? That we find ideas from the past that are useful. The kind of rhetorical power of this is potentially enormous. But I think there's another mode of historical writing and analysis that is also important, and that I think probably comes a little bit more naturally, to me at least, and I think to many of my colleagues, which is less to look back into the past to find usable models, as appealing as that might be, but also to consider why, in fact, the same problems keep coming back and why the similar proposals for reform keep coming back as well, right? The idea here is almost, I think of a kind of a metaphor from psychoanalysis, right? That what the historian does here is to diagnose repetition compulsions on the idea that the only way to exercise these compulsions is by bringing them to light and to say, you know, we keep falling prey to the same problems and we keep making really, really good proposals to fix them and they don't work. So why is that? Now, this can be depressing, of course, but I think it's also has an important critical function, which is to think about choke points, to think about sites where resistance to reform is enacted and why reform to problems that, you know, are kind of obviously diagnosable and for which there might exist a real consensus for reform keep getting stymied, right? Take the example of representation at the IMF. I mean, in some sense, everyone knows there's a huge problem here. The representation of the United States in the institution, certainly the representation of Western European countries in the institution, it's absurd, right? It just doesn't correspond to the basic realities of the world economy and global GDP today. There's an obvious choke point here, right? That the US with veto power simply won't countenance reforms that in this current context appears to redound to the benefit of a strategic rival like China. So you can have this consensus for reform, even, you know, at the IMF itself among, you know, many constituencies that simply in some sense, you know, if we don't take into consideration the political checkpoint that makes this so hard to realize, you know, kind of what are we doing here, right? So I think this is one mode for the historian to be useful. I think probably less in an obvious kind of movement building way, because I do think that there's a potentially dispiriting outcome to this analysis, but nonetheless in a really critical way to say that, look, these problems have been diagnosed for a long time, problems of representation, problem of lending practices, and so on and so forth. Very good reform ideas have existed for a long time, but it's really hard to fight technocracy with more technocracy. It's really hard to fight, to kind of win the battle for power simply in the realm of ideas and proposals. We also need to consider the path dependencies that have made power what it is today.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way that you described the use of history there as a kind of corrective. And that makes me think of also sort of what Richard was saying, which is the way that sort of tactically distorting the past can also be productive or helpful. And so there's this idea that historians often use of a useful past, and a useful past is almost always a distorted history of the past in certain ways, but one that serves particular rhetorical instrumental functions in some kind of a symbolic battle that's going on. And Lula's appeal to Marshall Plan this last 6 months or so, he was using it in a high-profile speech, as I recall, seemed to me an example of that, where, as Richard is saying, it's actually helpful to have a more one-dimensional understanding of the Marshall Plan as just a time when America supposedly was doing something out of the goodness of its heart. Because the more you know about the Marshall Plan, the less appealing it actually is, right, as a model for relationship to the rest of the world. So that's one thing that me and Christy and other people in our History and Political Economy project have sort of asked ourselves whether, too much history can be a bad thing for attempts to fight kind of rhetorical battles, or to sort of find useful paths in contingent moments where you're just trying to, beef up your arsenal for to push through a new coalition or a set of actors who might not otherwise see themselves in common. I think that having those happy stories is often more helpful. An example that I only learned of recently, it's similar to what Adriana just said about it's too bad we didn't have this conversation 6 months ago, is that the outgoing US Trade Representative, Catherine Tai from the Biden administration, apparently used to refer to historians as part of her constituency and would have meetings with historians to talk about previous moments, especially the earlier 20th century sort of interwar moment of the League of Nations and the Bretton Woods moment, as points of inspiration. And that's the kind of feedback loop that I think we're quite curious about. And I wonder if people have other examples of that from their work where it's actually been, as I think a couple of you said, sort of convenient to maybe flatten the past for polemical or tactical reasons, rather than to embrace it in its complexity. Richard, you unmuted. Does that suggest you want to jump in? Go ahead.
I mean, I think, well, you have to keep in mind, I think, Quinn, that these are not democratic institutions, right?
Right.
The principle on which they work is essentially so-called consensus building. I mean, that's kind of hardwired into the narrative that's the way to build up momentum and legitimacy for whatever you're trying to do. And I guess in a certain sense, in a consensus building environment, nuance tends to go out of the window, right? And in many respects it is damaging, I think. I mean, not that if you take an institution like UNCTAD, I mean, UNCTAD was founded on voting principles, right? I mean, in the principles that set up UNCTAD, there was as it is for the UN in general, there's voting was meant to be the way to resolve problems, and at some point in our history, that just kind of was put to one side, and consensus building became the way in which any conflicts were resolved. And I don't think it's necessarily, one can understand why that is the case, but it's not necessarily a healthy environment for building institutions that get things done, because ultimately the lowest common denominator that unites a disparate group of countries is where you tend to end up. And advanced economies can use that very skillfully in terms of the way in which they manipulate the system to So it's not just malfeasance on that. I mean, there's something kind of systemic in the nature of these institutions, I think, that does lead in that direction.
Another way that I maybe could ask this question too, that I've been thinking about, is how having a historical perspective can help you sort of measure the severity of crises as they present themselves, and whether having that historical knowledge helps, and if so, in what way. So being really concrete, it seems to me anyway, right now, that we are facing a kind of rupture in the conventions and norms around, especially transatlantic cooperation, but probably international cooperation that is unprecedented in my lifetime. And in those moments of crisis, how much does it help us to reach back to previous moments of crisis as instructive of the present? And if in your own experience, have you done so yourself? I mean, Brazil and the world economy have been through their own cycles. Is it helpful when things are really bad to try to use previous precedents, or does that simply distract from the uniqueness of every crisis?
I'll have a shot at that. I think, looking back on my period in government, and I think the team continues very much to work along these lines since I left. You're right, we flatten history in the case of presidential speeches because they have to be very short, and President Lula's speeches, although he sometimes is very verbose and he loves to talk, he has had cancer in his vocal cords. So we had to learn to develop this very muscular speech writing style where every single word and syllable is assessed for whether it's truly necessary. And that ends up collapsing things anyway. But with respect to these historical comparisons, I think we often used it, and, because President Lula does this himself, in more informal types of speech, as warnings, right? So he would say, like early on in the government, he said, I'm coming back to power for the third time after 20 years. And I go back to these conversations about Bretton Woods reform. It's the same conversation we were having in 2004, 20 years ago. And a consequence of inaction on effective reform, right? So we're not talking about the cosmetic, the tweaks, things sometimes get called reform that are not real reform. And that's why, you see that institutions that fail to reform themselves or to be open to reform efforts that come from outside, because I think that deep reform has to come from outside, they relegate themselves to the ash heaps of history. IOs seldom die, right? There's no big cemetery of international organizations. There may be, zombie fields, and sometimes they get revived temporarily. But I think, we use that. His own personal recollection is one instance where it was like, this is a warning. If those institutions were already losing some relevance there, then it will only accelerate now. And of course, we didn't predict, that, Trump would win the elections and that there would be this whole accelerationist movement and more and greater attacks on institutions. All of this, of course, began many years ago, but now I agree with you that the pace of questioning and breaking is unprecedented. So I think with respect to crisis, that kind of comparison, even when you have to flatten, is very useful. And it's very useful, especially to those who have lived through previous eras. It's not that youth do not know history, but I think, when President Lula talks about the debt crisis in Africa, and he makes a reference to Brazil having gone through, Latin America having gone through its own sovereign debt crisis, it harkens back to a series of experiences that at least part of the audience can tap into and say, okay, we should be solidary to, the calls from African states, because
Mhm.
I remember what it was like living in a country that was under seemingly eternal sovereign debt crisis. I remember as a child in Brazil how it permeated discussions around the kitchen table. So
Mm.
there are many uses to this flattening, and it can be
Mhm.
done positively or negatively.
Yeah, because you create these kind of emotionally powerful analogies or kind of equivalences. Can I ask you, though, one more thing there? Given the title of this session, can institutional reforms be made meaningful? Something you said there just struck me, which is that deep reforms must come from outside in the end. Did you say that? What
That's
do you
my
mean by-
hypothesis.
Can you
And
expand on that? That's interesting.
sure, I think so. I'm a sociologist by training, and in the sociology of organizations, it's not my field of expertise, but insofar as I studied this and I continue to be interested, whenever you build an institution, right, you congeal the norms, you congeal the practices, you build within a set bureaucracy, incentive structures, a professional body in the Weberian language. And there's like a certain stickiness to institutions. And
Mhm.
that means that there are vested interests, maybe on the part of, some powerful constituencies, even within the organization. So we see, for instance, with Bretton Woods, sometimes the highest leadership has quite progressive or relatively progressive statements, right? With Kristalina Georgieva, Banga at the World Bank. But then you have this layer of like senior management that is very recalcitrant. And I think that stems not only from, the natural stickiness of institutions, but also, I mean, in those cases, I would say, a dominant single world view that's still very much based on the Washington Consensus, with some, a nod here and there to the climate crisis.
Mhm.
And it makes it very difficult for true reform. I mean, effective reform, I'm talking about reform of decision-making structures.
Okay.
Anything before that to me is cosmetic or tweaks or some substantive changes, but that don't mess, in the good sense, with the structure, with the incentive to change the action of the organization. So for instance, with Bretton Woods, the real change that has come about, and there have been some small tweaks, the G20 has played a role, very limited, and to my great frustration, very limited. But you look at the UN, has the UN ever undergone like significant reform? No. The Security Council debate is even more fossilized than the Bretton Woods conversation because of what I just said. There are vested interests, those that locked in the power in the post-war period don't want to let go. And then, what Chomsky said, that the way to prevent debate from happening is to constrain the parameters of the debate, but then within those parameters allow as lively debate as possible. He said something along those lines. To me, that's a perfect description of these organizations. So change has to come from without, whether through a coalition like G20, BRICS Plus, or a coalition of countries that have highest level of leadership, or a further rupture. But I like to think that you don't need a third world war in order to have a new UN. I like to be a little bit more optimistic than that.
Well, that's a perfect setup then for the question I wanted to ask Jamie, because this is a familiar problem, right? I mean, the incumbents have no incentive to transform the existing structure. So short of a kind of Maoist moment like we're having in the United States, where there's an imperative to kind of attack the headquarters and dismantle it coming from the center, have we had precedent for this, Jamie, beyond wars, where reform from the outside ends up producing a better functioning organization on the inside?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I also want to say first that I agree completely with Adriana's framing of the problem here, that you have these institutions like the IMF, for example, where there's enormously lively debate, where Georgieva can kind of demonstrate commitment to long-term reforms, where there can be all these doctrinal reconsiderations about conditionality and austerity, and nonetheless, the institution as it actually operates in the world exhibits an enormous amount of inertia and resistance to change. And I would would say that I think this characterizes the institution over its entire history, that it does, on the one hand, demonstrate a kind of a plasticity, an amenability to some reform and some change, and at the same time is enormously kind of hidebound and resistant to fundamental change. And I think one obvious reason for that is precisely the simple fact of US dominance in this institution, and that change, when it does come and in the form that it comes, effectively has to come from this one site. And in some sense, I would then characterize or kind of slightly recharacterize the idea of change having to come from the outside. I think that that's right, but at the end of the day, it also has to come from the inside, as it were, from the US Treasury, right? Because anything short of a change at the US Treasury is going to be ultimately limited. Now, one thing about this idea of crisis, right? And of course, we have the world wars, and particularly the Second World War, on our minds as this moment in which kind of new possibilities are generated simply by the sheer scale of the crisis that the world faced, or the kind of overlapping crises that the world faced. And there's obviously, again, a kind of rhetorical power to this, but we don't want to simply suggest that short of world war, we can't have real change. I think there's also another crisis that is so recent that it's difficult to properly historicize, but I think it's actually very useful to think about, which is the pandemic. Because during the pandemic, I mean, this is kind of coming back to something Richard said about SDRs, about special drawing rights, is that in 2021, we saw the allocation of $650 billion of SDRs, the largest issuance of SDRs in the history of the IMF. And this, already from the vantage point of 2025 seems extraordinary. Of course, there's been tons of problems in, getting these SDRs to where they're needed, and the whole problem of rechanneling and recycling SDRs is a kind of an ongoing problem. But to my mind, even the fact that these were allocated at this moment of extraordinary crisis seems extraordinary, and seems like it should, I don't know how much this is talked about in the actual policy circles, but what were the precise conditions that made this possible at that moment? Now, for example, it seems like the congressional politics around SDRs is so toxic that to imagine a further allocation of SDRs that would, of course, potentially go to US strategic rivals like Iran seems kind of so far beyond the possibility of political, feasibility. In fact, there was even a bill introduced in the House by, I think, a Midwestern Republican that was, it was all about Iran and kind of the idea of kind of cutting off any, possible funding for Iran. But the upshot of it was that the US would never greenlight further allocation of SDRs because, money would effectively end up in the hands of the Iranian regime. So what was it that happened in 2021? What was the nature of the crisis beyond the kind of obvious things we know? Like, what were the particular coalitions that were built at that moment and the particular levers of power that were used to make this thing that certainly fell short of, kind of dramatic reform of the institution, but nonetheless made possible a kind of a politics of largesse that we want to encourage. And of course, further allocation of SDRs is the first thing that so many people call for when they're calling for actual kind of new policies or better policies, short of dramatic reform. Well, like, what made that possible at that particular moment?
Yeah, and I think that calls attention. Oh, Richard, go ahead.
Well, I think I should just kind of defend institutional turf here. I mean, one example of in a kind of internal, external pressure that did bring change was the creation of UNCTAD, right, in '64. It's the only real kind of reform to the Secretariat that has happened. And, and I guess, as Jamie said, the historian's job is to look at that moment and understand the choke points and the pressures and that created that. I guess I was struck. I watched recently this movie, Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, about the assassination of Lumumba, and which has a kind of special place in UN history because, of course, 9 months later, Hammarskjöld himself was assassinated by similar forces. Don't exactly know who, but by similar forces. But when you look at the film captures it, and I have that, we have that very vaunted view of Hammarskjöld, I think, anyone who's in the UN. But when you look at that history, it turns out that in the run-up to the assassination of Lumumba, the UN's role was not particularly, benign, or it's clearly in some respects, laid the groundwork for the assassination of Lumumba, and when you see the footage around that, it's incredible. It's very clear how frustrated an emergent generation of developing countries leaders were with the UN and the way in which it operated, and clearly the need for something different, in which they had more of a say, because their voices were essentially, and including the Soviet Union in the case of the assassination of Lumumba. He was Hammarskjöld completely marginalized Khrushchev, and there was real frustration there. And so, I think, looking at that moment, trying to think about it, and the reasons that UNCTAD in the end had its own Secretary General, the only other part of the UN system that had a Secretary General, had its own General Assembly, a board to make decisions independently to some extent, not completely, of the General Assembly. But the developing countries fought for a kind of parallel institution in which serious action on economic issues, obviously not security issues, could actually take place. And to some extent, that's a complicated history. And to some extent we did, right, including on SDRs, but on other issues that were pressing as developing countries tried to shift the rules of the international game, economic game in the 60s and 70s. We did things that made a difference.
Go ahead, Adriana.
Thank you. I partially agree with you, Richard. I think it depends on what we mean by reform, right? I was talking about the relative incapacity of major institutions to reform themselves insofar as key decision-making structures are concerned. It's very hard to find counterexamples. Maybe, a seat for Africa, which is super important, but it doesn't alter the mathematics of decision-making all that much. Now, when it comes to addition and subtraction, yes, I think things can happen. But again, it depends on sort of external pressure, right? So in addition to UNCTAD, I can think here of, the Peace Building Commission, for which developing countries fought very hard, including Brazil. And it was created, it exists, but it was subsumed under the Security Council. So again, you have an addition, and it's still subject to the same type of dominant decision-making structure. On subtraction, I think, the advanced economies have done a fantastic job. I don't agree with this, by the way, but even as, UNCTAD was created, what happened? EcoSoc, which should have been also a very important space for thinking about development and economic and social issues, was gradually emptied out. There are wonderful people there who do very brave work, and I had a lot of contact with them through the Committee on Development Policy. But where did those discussions end up? They ended up at the OECD. The EcoSoc was emptied, and its functions were turned over to an organization that remains very much dominated not only by advanced economies, but by the managerial turn. And that has been incredibly, so until now at least, successful in pushing for very neoliberal prescriptions, even as the advanced economies themselves moved away from that, right? At least until the recent elections in the United States. So addition and subtraction, take and add and take away an ornament from the Christmas tree, you can do. But to change the shape of that tree, I'm running into the limitations of my own analogy here, is much more difficult. And it's much more difficult because, whoever locked in power will fight tooth or nail, even as, ironically or perhaps tragically, it's patent that the loss of credibility, legitimacy, fitfulness for purpose, whatever the UN speak is massive. We would not be panicking as much about the international organizations if they actually had been reformed in terms of the decision-making structures, right? Maybe the US wouldn't be such a big contributor, also wouldn't be such a big influence on ideas. And unfortunately now, with the withdrawal or perhaps even greater attacks by the US, there will be some other power reconfigurations. That, I think, is interesting, because others will step in to fill the void of leadership. And it might not be immediate, the effects might not be short-term, but this will happen because multilateralism is also an opportunity. And that's missing in the current thinking, I think coming from Washington.
Yeah, that is actually a perfect lead into a couple of the questions which are coming in now from the participants. I think that people should be encouraged to put questions in the Q&A, and I'll sort of fold them into questions for the panelists here. And it actually is a kind of an extension of this interesting conversation that's beginning here. I think about this idea of reform from outside and kind of unexpected consequences of external shocks, let's say, right? I mean, no one would have welcomed COVID, but as Jamie was saying, the effects of it, opening up possibilities were quite notable in retrospect. What Adriana was just saying about the current kind of abnegation of a commitment to internationalism by the current American administration could also, and it seems to me what you're saying, be seen as a kind of opening also for the creation of a vacuum into which non-US actors could move and perhaps begin to rethink international governance in a more fundamental way. A couple of people in the chat and the Q&A are asking questions that are similar, I would say. And maybe I'll just home in on this one from Zachary Kyler. He's actually addressing it to you, Adriana, as well, but I think all three of you would be equipped to answer it. Does it seem like the current far-right governments like the United States are actually attempting to break institutions, or are they just trying to subordinate and remake them? I think this is similar to the question in the European Union about the way someone like Giorgia Meloni has gone from trying to break the EU to just making it, her EU. So what do we think? Is that vacuum really going to emerge, or will this just be turning the international forum into even more naked place for the exercise of American realpolitik? Do we have any precedent for this as well?
Yes. I can speak quickly to this. I think it depends on the space. With respect, for instance, to the international climate regime, in some ways, we've been there before, twice, because, there are two precedents for the US leaving or not adhering, the Kyoto Protocol and the UNFCCC. And we can make a lot of criticisms about the way that the climate regime is going, but as a piece of multilateralism, it still stands. And so, we made it past those periods of, US absence. And because, again, it is a multilateral space, it depends too on other actors. And, I think Brazil is now stepping up again and assuming a role of leadership, but many others, Colombia is doing really important things. You have even, smaller countries in Africa. You have the small island states, Barbados coming up with, very punchy proposals. So it doesn't, one actor can't just torpedo the whole thing, but it can make substantial damage. I think there are other spaces where, it's a bit of wait and see, but not only of the United States, the WTO, right? That whole paralysis goes back to what at least Obama, right, with a dispute resolution mechanism. So I think, the current administration in the US has a very different view of international trade, what national interest is, and what it can be wielded for in terms of empowerment, right, of the nation state. Will there be counter proposals? Are there more constructive views than, imposing carbon border adjustment or, unilateral type anti-deforestation legislation that ends up being punitive towards developing countries rather than attack the hard to abate sectors in Europe? I think there is a space to come up with really interesting proposals, but the timing will be affected because obviously, not everybody will be on board, not only in terms of the US, but there will be some bandwagoning, right? The other day I saw some high-level Indonesian official questioning, well, if the United States is leaving, this doesn't apply, the climate regime doesn't apply to the United States, why should Indonesia care? And I like to think it was a rhetorical device, but some actors, I think Milei in Argentina, of course, will bandwagon on anything that the US does pretty much. So it's a wait and see. But again, it's very hard to sink a ship of an international organization. And sometimes they lie dormant, right? In our region, we revived an organization, which is the Amazon Treaty Cooperation Organization. It's many decades old. And it was kind of, a bit slow and nobody was talking about it. And we held a big summit in the Amazon, and it's a regional effort, not global, but it may have global impact if it helps to accelerate, for instance, the fight against deforestation. So there are other spaces, there are regional spaces and even global spaces that it's a bit of a wait and see.
Maybe I can use that as an opening, and Richard, I'll let you jump into the answer to this because it's a continuation of the question, which is, I've already really enjoyed the way that, Adriana, you've opened this up by bringing in other actors that are not the United Nations, let's say. So OECD, the way certain things move there, the resuscitation of the Amazon Treaty Organization, as you say. A couple of the questions go in that direction too, and I wonder if we could use a bit more of a historical perspective here alongside that, the introduction of those other actors. Thomas Kruse asks about bilateral arrangements, asking to what degree have UN partnerships, also, I guess, bilateral with large philanthropies as well, kind of change the shape of the tree in your metaphor. But I would also think that bilateral trade arrangements might also be, more practically speaking, the stuff by which trade happens, rather than that the WTO, which has always been actually of limited importance in some ways already. And then relatedly, a question of previous moments where there have been large divisions among the North. This is a question from Tim Herschel Burns. We think about North-South as being the kind of structuring power relation since 1945, those of us who think of international political economy more than geopolitics. But Tim asks whether there are historical comparisons for the splintering of northern countries. So when Nixon arbitrarily left the gold standard without consultation with European allies, and whether we can learn or think about sort of potential North-South alliances sort of across that division based on historical precedent. So this is maybe thinking outside of the global box and thinking underneath that layer, what other kind of geometries have existed.
I'll jump in. I mean,
Please.
just on one point, I mean, you yourself have pointed to the different factions within the Trump coalition, and it's and two of which seem to be fairly familiar. It may well be the case that the anarcho-capitalist, or however you want to describe it, is a new trend in that, but the others are fairly familiar, and they may not be as destructive ultimately as at least you portray the anarcho-capitalist strain of that alliance. And so I guess it's very difficult to make a sense of what's going on, really, because there is so much uncertainty and unpredictability in it. I mean, I guess, and again, you've written about this. I mean, this fracturing of the North was an important element in the emergence of, and to some extent the success of, the new international economic order discussions. And that was first of all, I think that was certainly there was a fracturing between the US and Europe. I mean, UNCTAD was the secretariat for the NIEO, and there were European allies. The Dutch were to some extent sympathetic. The Italians, the French occasionally. I think Michael Frenzak's book goes into that history.
Kreisky, Olaf Palme.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not there at all today, right now. Let's be clear. This is not, lumping everything on Trump as the problem here. I don't think is very helpful for trying to understand the international divisions and tensions. I think that would not be a helpful way of proceeding. But there were also divisions within the US right at that time. You had the kind of incipient neoliberals in the Treasury. And then you had Kissinger. I mean, Kissinger was one who wanted to talk to the South. He saw that as a way of getting at the Soviet Union to some extent. I mean, bringing in developing countries, taking it seriously. He turned up to UNCTAD conferences, the only time a U.S. Secretary of State has ever done that. So there were divisions within the U.S., I think, over what happens having trashed the Bretton Woods institutions. There was divisions between the U.S. and including geopolitical. The Vietnam War was still resonant, right, in thinking about geopolitics. And that division was certainly, I think, incredibly important for the NIEO to become a way of framing the reform of the international architecture at that time. We know it failed in the end, but that was a very important part of the story that I think people sometimes forget. I just don't see. I mean, in that maybe I'm more pessimistic than Adriana. I don't see Europe in that position right now. It just doesn't. In our world, in UNCTAD, for example, the Europeans were in some respects more difficult and obstructionist than the Americans, for example, and it's not clear where they stand on these issues anymore. And I suspect you'll see that in negotiations in the climate space this year, and you will in the financing for development space for sure this year. So it's a difficult. I think it's a difficult moment, but there are some interesting parallels.
Jamie, do you have anything to add? Maybe on the sort of alternative fora, things that are not the big global ones?
Yeah, I mean, there's an obvious theoretical point to make that in the case of, development lending, that the more kind of the greater proliferation of creditors, the greater proliferation of alternative regional arrangements and so on and so forth, the better terms that borrowers could potentially achieve, that the rise of the various, BRICS development banks and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and these things, offers some kind of potentially promising evolution away from a Washington consensus-oriented world. But I think that the jury's really out on how this will play out or could play out. I mean, the problem with a lot of these regional arrangements is that they don't have enough money, that they are ultimately, while potentially alternatives to the IMF, tend to work alongside the IMF. Many of them are a little battle tested. The BRICS arrangements has a problem that it includes Russia right now. I mean, Chinese kind of dominated institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that in many ways emerged precisely because of the failure of reform in the Bretton Woods institutions to give China a greater voice in these institutions. I mean, there is a lot of money here. Obviously, this institution is much better capitalized than others and is becoming more so, in a sense that it's kind of, it's doing something differently from the Belt and Road Initiative, for which enthusiasm has obviously, by and large evaporated. So maybe here, I'm not sure we have great evidence, though, that an institution like this would operate very differently at the end of the day. I don't think we have great evidence yet that, at least Chinese state-owned banking institutions really kind of play by different rules, so to speak, in the broad sense of the term. So again, a kind of proliferation of more arrangements, the more the merrier. Borrowers can kind of pick and choose, potentially get better terms. I think there's a lot to be said for this, but I think at the end of the day, who's actually making the loans, who are they working with, still really matters. And I haven't, I mean, I'm not in the policy world on this. I'm an outside observer, but from what I've seen, I haven't seen a lot that makes me enormously encouraged.
I remember at some point you said something to me that really stuck with me, which is your own personal definition of neoliberalism is just the way bankers think. And that seems to be similar to what you're saying there. And actually connects to a very interesting question from Lara Merling in the Q&A here, which is, I guess, more about the kind of software that unites a lot of these institutions. So the way she puts it is, resistance to reform within the Bretton Woods institutions and broader efforts to move away from the austerity model often rely on neoclassical economic frameworks that are then weaponized as a technocratic, quote, proven approach to economic policy. Given this entrenched reliance, how can reform debates effectively challenge and engage with these prevailing economic narratives? In other words, what do you all think? We've been talking a lot about alliances, contingent moments, shocks, disruptions, but is there another story here about just the kind of the reasoning that unites people inside of these institutions that is itself the kind of core obstacle? Adriana.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I think about this very much. I think I worked firsthand on this issue, not only because is this kind of, dominant paradigm so deeply entrenched in Bretton Woods, but also because, many elites intellectual, economic elites in the global south also adhere and sometimes are even more zealous in defending that paradigm. And even in a relatively progressive government, such as President Lula's current government, it is a broad coalition government with an extremely difficult Congress. So obviously there are all sorts of, political constraints and on how much he can shift things towards a more progressive sphere. But within the experience of the G20, I mean, often it took a lot of political effort internally to either work with or sidestep some barriers to get progressive ideas across. So let me give you one example. The taxation of the super rich. This idea did not come from the working groups of the G20, which, especially in the finance track, it's actually a very conservative structure. I came to the conclusion that the G20 is the coordination body, but it's not a reform body. It didn't start out that way. So efforts to reform run into several barriers, including the fact that the working groups that are repeated right across the presidencies have these like set co-chairs, and some of them, it's France, it's OECD, it's, South Korea, and nobody dares change this. So in order to be a reform channel, the G20 needs reform. But with the taxation of the super rich, you had groups in academia and civil society, you had, different coalitions put together, and through the action of different actors within civil society and within the government, let's just say, to summarize the story, we ended up landing this in the mouth of the finance minister, and from there in the mouth of President Lula, who was like, oh, this is a great idea. This completely matches what I have been thinking and saying about the unbearable status of inequality in today's world. But you had to sidestep a number of actors in order to do that, even internally. Now, I just joined the Global Fund for a New Economy, which is an incipient effort, but I think, we collectively are very much thinking about this. How do you strengthen alternative ways of thinking so that you can kind of break this paradigm and at least present a broader range of alternatives rather than have people reflexively default to the, structural adjustment modes. And history is very important. Isn't it a manufactured amnesia, the fact that some Asian countries have managed to develop along several different dimensions through greater state planning and greater role of public finance rather than neoliberal prescriptions? But this gets thrown out in the IMF Springs and Annual. So we have to break down taboos, everything from government procurement. It's not a bad word to talk about government procurement and how you can link it to your green industrial policy. That should be part of the normal conversation, even if you disagree. And we have to mainstream ideas that actually are already implemented, but they don't gain traction due to the stickiness of the institutions and opposition by vested interests in a number of countries.
I think I warned Adriana when she took the job that the G20 was a exercise in bureaucratic sclerosis. I think, and it's an interesting case. It did begin as a reform institution, obviously. It reached its peak with Gordon Brown and attempts after the global financial crisis to do something, but it's been downhill ever since. I think that's definitely the case. I don't know where to go really with those kinds of issues that Adriana raised. For me, finance is the most conservative and most incestuous part of the international. Anyone who's been to, and we had to do it, IMFC, spring and fall meetings. It's a very closed club of people who know each other and are comfortable with the common language that they have. and don't really want that world to be disturbed in any way, shape, or form. If, a character like, I remember that, a character like Yanis Varoufakis comes in for a very short period as the Greek, and no one talks to him, basically. It's just, no one is a kind of virus in the room of some kind that is not going to be clearly part of the discussion. And so that, I mean, and this is where, again, history kind of comes in, I think, Quinn, and I don't think people like Georgieva have got a sense of that at all. The IMF was to some extent set up. I mean, its principle was financial stability, and the people who set up the IMF knew full well that they had to control the movement of capital. That is, they couldn't have a stable international financial system without controlling and to some extent disciplining capital. It was not clear if that would be done at the multilateral level or whether you'd simply give the space for national governments to actually do that. And at some point, as you know, in the late 70s, early 80s, these institutions became the opposite. They became handmaidens for the movement and the unrestricted movement of international capital. And in that world, it's very difficult to project alternative ideas, and certainly very difficult to project progressive ideas. Until I think we kind of tackle that outside influence, that pernicious outside influence of a world of highly fluid, mobile, and very powerful financial actors, it's not clear what kind of reform, at least in the economic space, is possible. Although it's happening in trade to some extent, and that's another question that you might want to pursue, Quinn.
Yeah, so that's great. I mean, part of what I hear from you is that, and that we know from the histories, is that the IMF, even though we think of it perhaps as an economic institution, it was a political institution, right? It was designed to serve a particular political aim, and there was a consensus and a settlement around what that political aim should be. And to have now come to a place where we think of it as a depoliticized, actor through which financial interests can pursue their interests is obviously an inversion. That allows me to ask a question through Mirak Hosman in the Q&A here, who I believe was at our gathering in Venice. We were talking about the NIEO in May. And he asks about the potential for reformist action emerging from within international institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and UNCTAD, especially at the staff or managerial level. Jamie sort of alluded to this, how the research division at the IMF is often, seemingly willing to be more critical than the lending wing of the institution. And I want to maybe put a slightly more sharp point on this and ask are we sort of agreeing that economists are the problem? I have JB shaking his head, but I mean, is it that we need to repoliticize and in some cases maybe even legalize and speak through a language of law rather than a language of economics for these reforms to happen? And if not, then why not?
I just want to quickly on that. The reason why I shook my head is kind of going back to some of the points that Adriana and Richard meant is that, and this is a little bit more, I think, an answer to your previous question, but in some sense, I think economic doctrine can be a red herring because some of the things we don't like about how these institutions work, and I guess I'm thinking more of the IMF here than any others, the kind of the repetition compulsion I alluded to earlier, the fact that this institution has done things at many different moments of its existence that look quite similar and that have occurred at moments when the kind of reigning paradigm of economics was very different. Take conditional lending, for example, based on fiscal and monetary constraints, demands for fiscal and monetary constraints. This happened in the Keynesian era. It's happened in the neoliberal era. And the IMF itself referring to this as a post-neoliberal era, or at least some people in its research wing saying, is neoliberalism dead, or whatever that one famous piece was from 2016, right? Conditional lending based on demands for fiscal and monetary constraints are now happening in the era in which apparently the whole doctrine about this has been revised. So in some sense, maybe there's a simple institutional thing here that the research wing, I wrote a book that was kind of historically very, critical of the IMF, and it got reviewed very well in the IMF's official journal, very vibrant intellectual space, full of debate. Someone once said to me, the IMF is just full of young Marxists now. But and obviously that's an exaggeration, but I know people work there, they're smart, they've got, their head in the right place, blah, blah, blah. But like, what does that matter? And how much could the focus on simply kind of disrupting paradigms in academic economics, like how much could that actually be a red herring if we're actually thinking about how to implement reforms and what these institutions actually do? So again, there is this kind of prosaic point about, bureaucratic division, but I also think there's a broader thing to consider that, seen over the long term, the very flexibility of these institutions within different reigning kind of doctrinal paradigms is in some sense, part of their power.
As the only economist, Richard, would you like to defend the discipline?
I mean, I think I probably agree with Jamie. I mean, it's not clear to me that their economic thinking is the dominant force here. And it's and unlike Bretton Woods, where essentially there were no bankers present in the discussions. I think there was one or two. I think it's not true that there were none. I think Eric Haliner's book has some discussion of that. The world, that world at spring meetings is dominated by people who are constantly moving in and out of the private financial sector and into some sort of bureaucratic decision-making positions. And that is it's a revolving door, and it's a very pernicious influence, quite clearly, on the way in which an institution that was set out to, I think Dexter White and Keynes had the idea that they would be controlling these people. It's become an institution that to some extent is controlled by them. And there's a real profound change, I think, Quinn, in the way in which finance has, become the main protagonist, I think, within shaping the kind of thinking about the international economy, not just finance probably, but the international economy more generally.
That might actually be a good chance to bring in this other question. One of the interesting through lines I feel like we've had in this discussion is to think about the kind of actors just to the side of the most obvious spotlight, sort of center stage of the United Nations and its international organizations, to think about alternative forums and also alternative actors, whether they're the banking sector having a revolving door with decision makers and something like the IMF. Bhumika Muchala has a question related to this. They ask about especially the role of credit rating agencies, which even if IFIs have sort of slightly reduced the coercion in their conditionality arrangements, nevertheless, like the dominant role of those big CRAs is not going anywhere. So is there any way that, beyond changing or tweaking even the decision making or working differently with the Articles of Agreement in something like the IMF, if you have outside of that still the kind of self-appointed arbiters of where finance goes that remain equally as strong, then how much change is actually possible? And is there any way of regulating then that external future?
I'll say something briefly on the role of credit rating agencies. I mean, there are all kinds of conversations, right? Some of them, the more conservative ones, which I think are marginally acceptable to the epistemic community that Richard was just talking about, is maybe, revising the stress test methodologies in order to incorporate climate and biodiversity risks, right? And then, of course, you have more radical conversations. I know that in the African, at least in the think tank space around the G20, there's a lot of thinking about, the political bias that's built into these kind of black boxes of capitalism. And what do you do about it? I mean, there have been conversations about alternative CIAs, but ultimately it's like it's a strange trust mechanism, right? It's based on this trust in a particular type of expertise / dogma. And while that remains at the center of the system, I think it's a conversation that will always be viewed as very, very dangerous by those most vested in maintaining the system.
There's a couple of interesting questions here. Then if you have something to say to this question that I just asked, you can also fold it in about maybe other routes to reform. I mean, one is coming from Leonardo Derenze, MA student at the University of Sao Paulo. And he's asking about, whether there's a route of sort of more political participation. Can there be a kind of pressure from below? Zachary Kyler has a question for Richard that's sort of about inside the institutions, which is this consensus building culture that you described actually part of the problem? I mean, would voting actually produce better outcomes? And then maybe a third pressure point that we haven't mentioned is the role of philanthropy. So someone asked about this, and one thinks, of course, about the way that the Bill Gates Foundation has effectively been integrated now into the international community as an important source of funding and also decision making. So are there procedural changes, pressures from third-party philanthropies, or kind of bottom-up pressures that maybe thinking historically too, we could say, that was a place where these things actually made a difference?
Can I just put in, because most of the discussion has been about finance, about the international trading system, and it's kind of cropped up in a number of points. I think you raised the issue of bilateral, or someone raised the issue of bilateral versus bilateral trade agreements tend to be worse, of course, than and regional trade agreements are worse than the kind of pressures that many countries face inside the developing countries face, at least inside the WTO. So, it's not in and of it. These are not in and of themselves solutions, I don't think. But and trade is interesting because, as you know, you could argue it's the most neoliberal space, right? In the sense that it's the one rules-based part, genuinely rules-based part of the system with with mechanisms to discipline recalcitrant states. I mean, that's including firms being able to do that in the case of ISDS. But it seems to be the weak point in the system now, and that's certainly going to be exaggerated under Trump. But it's not. Again, I don't think Trump is the source of that. I think the tensions in trade and the reaction and resistance from developing countries to, for example, the Uruguay round began very early in the late 90s, and you had Seattle and other events, and clearly that is I think that and outside forces were important in that case, right? Civil society, I think, was an important player in highlighting the kind of biases and asymmetries that had been signed up to in various trade agreements. And but it seems like the most vulnerable part of the system right now. I mean, the WTO is defunct. I mean, as it can't do anything. You've got people leaving the ISDS and finding ways of escaping the bits that they've signed into. You've got the Europeans leaving the Energy Charter, which was a similar thing that dealt with the energy system. So that's the one. Ironically, maybe that's the one part of the system that does seem to be collapsing the most. I don't think developing countries have yet got a sense of what they can do about that, or what they want to do about that, actually. And that's an opportunity, I think, for kind of rethinking reform in a space that is clearly already in a pretty degenerate situation.
Adriana or Jamie, do you have examples of what you think of as sort of neglected, sort of outside actors or pressures that have ended up creating lasting reforms, for better or for worse?
I'll speak, I think, quickly on the role of philanthropy, and I've just stepped into my new role, so it's a field that I've dealt with as someone who was in government. And there's a sense that, there are circumstances in which philanthropy makes a very big difference. It partly has to do with the unbearable state of world inequality, and the fact that there are individuals and families amassing money, and some of them, willing to give towards more or less progressive ideas. But if I'm not mistaken, I think, Bloomberg just offered to step in and cover the expenses of the UNFCCC that the US will retreat on. I could be making that up, but I think pretty sure I read that late night. But there have been other instances, and in the G20, in the Brazilian presidency, I mean, we saw how the role of philanthropy was really important in order to, help make the meetings happen, and they make bridges. It's any actor has interests, has preferences, has divisions. With the Gates Foundation might be a different view than the Bloomberg Foundation, than X Foundation. So X Foundation, I'm not talking about Elon Musk. I'm just using the letter.
The Musk Foundation only funds demographic research at
The
the
Musk
University of
Foundation,
Texas, Austin. I can tell
anti-government.
you that story another time.
But I think one neglected, if not an actor space, is the regional. And I know that, it's been really difficult here, but we in Latin America, if you want to study forum shopping, please come to our region. We are so good at creating spaces for forum shopping that we define our own region depending on the interlocutor. It's South America, it's Latin America, and the Caribbean. And that has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that it's very flexible. So if there's a space where this is intractable because, Argentina's current government is there, would never get this through, I don't know, you try taking it to another space. But of course, the downside is that sometimes you have a lack of continuity. And the regional spaces have been so politicized that right now, I think we're encountering a very difficult scenario. And we need civil society and academia, I think, to remind the current government, that this should be one of the top priorities. And two, that it's possible to think even about integration, not just cooperation, on new bases. So what are the new pillars for thinking regionally? Is it renewable energy? Is it, just transition more broadly? Is it green industrial policy? I think there is a huge gap, certainly in our region, to be filled. I just came back from Cape Town, and our African friends are always complaining about the AU and how it's slow and there are gaps. They are light years ahead of us in most things. The sophistication of regional arrangements in Africa is something that we have a lot to learn from, which, by the way, is also very important that you have more Global South historians here. I'm not a historian, so I don't count, but I'm sure that in your project, you're also thinking of Africans and Latin Americans and
Definitely.
Asians.
Yeah. In fact, as a bit of maybe relevant background there, the origin of this History and Political Economy project was basically observing the attempts to go beyond neoliberalism in the United States disciplinarily and institutionally, and within economics and philosophy and political science and law. The assumption seemed to be that neoliberalism sort of started in the United States and therefore would potentially die in the United States. And for historians, that's just a completely untenable and absurd proposition. Obviously, the laboratories of neoliberalism have been beyond the borders of the United States. So yeah, absolutely, folding those into like one larger narrative is absolutely at the core of what we're trying to do. Jamie, did you have a final thought?
I was going to say something, I guess, on this point that was optimistic, perhaps.
Perfect.
Cautiously
1 minute left.
optimistic.
That's exactly what we're looking for.
Excellent. So, I mean, while I think everyone here has emphasized the incredible obstacles faced to reform, I do think there have been reforms, and I think that they matter, and I think that there has been an important role played by civil society groups, Global South governments, experts like Richard and Kevin Gallagher here at the GDP Center and others, and US Congress people recently in getting, for example, the IMF to at least slightly amend its policy around surcharges. I mean, if there was ever a kind of a consensus, it was that these surcharges were absurd, robbing Peter to pay Paul at best, if not just like woefully punitive and with almost no economic justification and theories about moral hazard whatsoever. And you know, they're not gone, right? They're still there, but the policy has been amended. They apply to fewer countries, and this is a victory, I think, of at least a partial victory of mobilization and the incredible effort that was put into getting this policy change on behalf of many, many groups and many individuals literally around the world. And so I think, you know, while I, you know, have again emphasized the kind of choke points and the difficulties of reform, that, like, you know, these things should be at least partially celebrated, or at least the effort should be recognized that went into getting these victories that do have material implications for people, very real ones.
Well, I think that is a perfect place to end it. Glimmer of hope in a dark time. And I just want to thank the three of you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your experience. And I'm sure that everyone feels the same way. And we hope to speak to you